This is What's Wild in New Hampshire by wildlife biologist Eric Orr. As promised the other day, I promised to get out one of my diaries. I have 50, almost 50 years worth of diaries, 40 something of my years, my 3+ decades at New Hampshire Fishing Game Department. And during that time, one of the things I did in the mid 1990s was to send live fisher, thanks to the New Hampshire Trappers Association and a number of trappers that participated over the 3-year program to restore fisher to Pennsylvania, plus 2 other states over the decades. So it actually began, the fisher trapping season in New Hampshire is the month of December. So I'm looking at December 2nd, 1994. So up to headquarters to pick up a fisher from Murray Fay. Murray Fay was the bio aid. And I had gone to the UNH Research Center down in Brentwood, a former Fish and Game property, the old pheasant farm, and they had a number of large cages. They were about 6 or 7 feet long by 4 feet by 4 feet, and I took several and put them down in my neighbor's barn, Rick Hamlet's barn, down the road here in Epsom, and knew that I had to have a place to put the fisher until I could ship them out of New Hampshire. And what I did is I would gather the fisher by day and put them in plastic tubes that are about this long and about this big around that were sent to me by the Penn State folks, Tom Surface, and I would put the fisher in there and the next morning have them at the Manchester airport for the transport to the airport in Pennsylvania. I think, whatever airport, or you don't remember, served Penn State. And so this is December 2nd, 1994. The first fisher that I picked up was trapped by Roger Burnham. He and his dad were longtime trappers. Roger still is. Anyways, so Roger Burnham is, according to my diary of December 2nd, 1994, was the very first one to contribute a fisher. The trappers were paid for them, I think $200 each for live fisher. December 3rd, I was contacted by Conservation Officer Jim Goss up in Whitefield. I headed north. That was, so Friday, December 2nd was a Friday. So the next day, Saturday, went up and picked a fisher up that Jim Goss had picked up. I actually picked up 2 fisher that day, Saturday, December 3rd. December 4th, up to Powder Mill Hatchery and picked up another fisher from Mike Nason. It was a male fisher. And the next day, Mike Page, a longtime trapper here, brought a fisher in. Ted Walski reported he had one that had died overnight. I went back to Brentwood and picked up more cages. And so basically almost every day through at least early to mid-December in 1994, I was picking up fisher, live fisher. Here one said December 8th, no fisher today. So unusual day. If I wrote there was no fisher, that means most every other day I would go around during the day and into the evening and pick up these fisher. Let's say Friday, so a week later, Friday, December 9th, I've got fisher. So apparently several more fisher that day. So yes, I was the kind of the middleman. The New Hampshire trappers trapped live fisher in cage traps primarily, and I collected them over a 3-year period and shipped them to Pennsylvania. And I have since learned, of course, that restoration effort in Pennsylvania has been very successful. Well, I have been trying to read about various fur bearers and game animals in Hellnet Silver's A History of New Hampshire Game and Fur Bearers. I'm going to take a few minutes and write and read about her historical perspective of fisher. This book was published in the mid-1950s. It's going to be a little bit boring, but here is her chapter on Fisher. The White Mountain National Forest was once and may again be the home of the largest single concentrations of fisher in the United States. They were once so abundant they were a nuisance to trappers of northern New Hampshire forests, following the lines of sable traps, sable marten, stealing and the captured marten. Summers, 1898. Towards the end of the 19th century, they became comparatively scarce. Weeks, 1888, says they became rare in Coos County after the deer had practically disappeared. So by the 1880s or before, the deer were gone, as were the fisher, and the fisher could, quote, could no longer eke out a cold winter upon the carcass of a superannuated old buck, doe, or fawn killed by hunters or the bobcat. Hamilton, 1939 notes that they have been well known to kill deer. The fisher can catch and kill a hedgehog, porcupine, and is unaffected by its quills. He kills them by flipping them on their back and disemboweling them. The late Irwin Palmer saw a fisher kill a hedgehog on the Greeno Trail a few years ago. He also saw them run down and kill squirrels in treetops. A marten can catch the squirrel and kill a squirrel, but a fisher can catch and kill a marten. Hunt, 1934. On the killing of porcupines by fisher, Byron Lowe, formerly a warden with the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department, writes, "The fisher is very fond of hedgehogs, and is not uncommon thing to find where a whole family of hedgehogs has been killed by this vicious little animal. The quills will not work into a fisher as they will into any other animal. Nature has given him two skins, so to speak, and one that never finds the quills in the flesh, but always in between those two skins. I have killed old male fisher with more than 50 quills in them, but all were lying flat between these two skins." Isn't that amazing? There is something about the inner skin, if we may call it that either dissolves the point of the quill or turns it. Cross, 1924. Cohalan, 1941, also describes the habit and confirms that statement that the quills ordinarily do no harm, although he says that at times they do cause death. Hamilton, 1935, lists porcupines among the preferred food species of the fisher and states the quills pass through the alimentary canal without harm. DeVos, 1952, reports that fisher are sometimes killed by the quills. A specimen brought to the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department in 1950 was full of quills, and many being embedded in the throat and intestinal tract. The animal was not killed by them, however, but had been taken accidentally in a trap, so the fisher season was closed then. Quoting Seaton, Hunt writes that a fisher has been known to kill coons and even the bay lynx. It will fight off a large number of dogs when cornered and can jump 40 feet from a tree to the ground. DeVos, 1952, believe it is less arboreal in its habits than generally supposed, and found little evidence that it did much traveling in trees, although able to climb. Besides porcupine, Hamilton, 1939, lists among the food species of fisher mice, squirrels, fox, raccoons, and marten. Hare are an important item in their diet. If fisher sometimes kill bobcats, it appears the bobcats also prey to some extent on fisher. The New Hampshire Fish and Game Department, 1933, reported Warden Goodwin sent us a fisher cat that was one of several dug out of a den and killed by a bobcat. The following observations of fisher tracks quoted from Fish and Game Notes, Hunt, 1934, is the most interesting in some respects, similar to the observations of DeVos. Quote, "Last week in a wild and remote section of New Hampshire, we came upon a strange trail. Some animal with a foot the size of a big fox had come along in the newly fallen sprinkle of snow in a series of square track jumps. It was a fresh track of a large fisher, one of the rarest animals in the state. So this is 1934. So a fisher was one of the rarest in the state. We followed immediately in hopes of learning more about this once famous fur bearer. The track led through a swamp region onto a patch of ice. The animal kept circling as it were, swinging its head and coming into the wind as hunting mink will do. Every stump and hummock was inspected, and when the trail led into thick woods, we found that the fisher, cat-like, walked along logs and hopped on the tops of rocks and windfalls. It easily covered a mile in the winding and doubling back and exploring without advancing more than a quarter mile. In one place, it had spent considerable time following out some squirrel tracks. In another place, it had hunted unsuccessfully for wood mice. Finally, it was joined by another, even larger fisher, and the two circled out away from each other like greyhounds, only to join again a few hundred yards ahead. Still under quotes, at last we came to a spot where the ground was tracked up, and here, under a blowdown, we found the frozen, half-eaten carcass of a snowshoe rabbit. All of it had been eaten except the hindquarters. The rabbit had evidently been killed for some days and cached. The pair of fisher again continued circling and winding, and after crossing and recrossing one another's tracks several times, met again at another rabbit cache. Here they feasted on a second frozen carcass. A short distance further, on the edge of a swamp, they dug out a third snowshoe hare and ate some more. They were evidently following a route which was familiar and frequently traveled. Again, under quotes, after tracking around here, it took 2 or 3 hours to follow them out. We found they had headed up into some hardwood hills and started hunting for red squirrels. There were fresh tracks of red squirrels and a few cottontail tracks, an occasional partridge track, but they were unsuccessful. They came to a small clearing and stopped for a moment. The track showed an interesting story. I'm going to skip some of that. On the edge of the clearing, a fox had killed a junco and was apparently devouring when the fisher came along and surprised him. The fox left with long, prodigious jumps. The fisher snapped up the junco, except for the half dozen wing feathers, and then struck straight through the woods to a mountain brook where numerous trout had come up, who spawned in, and many had remained. The tracks of the larger fishes showed that he had followed the bank of the frozen brook until it came to a space where the brook was shallow and unfrozen. In one place he had taken a standing jump across and landed 8 feet or 9 feet away. He continues to talk about that. So anyways, fisher were very rare. So at that time, when they found a fisher, it goes on to talk more about that. Let's see here. Shortly after Hunt recommended closing the season, a law was passed to that effect, and said there was no season or fisher since 1934. So the season was closed in 1934. Looking at a table which includes fisher trapped between 1928 and 1953. 1928, the number was 8. 1929, 7. So this was 1930, 10. So during the Great Depression, when pelts had some significant value, 1941, 1 fisher. So the season was closed, but apparently there were some incidental catches. Fish were very plentiful in Waterville Valley in 1936. Within 4 years, they were much less common there, according to Joe Piper, U.S. Forest Ranger. So I pick up here 1953. In 1953, Maine reported fisher becoming relatively common in numbers of towns bordering New Hampshire. At that time, they were not generally considered common in the state, but were more frequently seen in the regions north of Winnipesaukee, particularly in the lower altitudes. Henry Laramie, who hired me as the first bear biologist, biologist with the Management and Research Division of the department, believed that fisher reached their peak along the eastern border about that time, and 2 years later, at this writing, so 1955, the, their peak along the eastern border 2 years later. At this writing are less numerous there now. Two fish were observed in Effingham in September of 1954 by biologist Forrest Frog and Carl Lacklade. In 1955, two were killed in Farmington. So they were quite rare across much of the state. The population peaked. I became the New Hampshire Fish and Game fur bearer biologist in 1980. Actually 1979, and that's when the fisher numbers were peaking. There were some years in the late 70s and early 80s that trappers took upwards of 1,000 fisher in New Hampshire. As of the last number of years, the fisher population has declined. Here is the table of fur bearer takes. This one happens to be from 2010 to 2017. In 2010, the winter of 2010-11, 339 fish were taken. So by the late 90s and into the 2000s, fisher numbers had declined. 260 in 2011, 227 in 2014, only 140 in 2015, 90 in 2016, and only 44 in 2017. And I think that is a similar number that were trapped in 2020. So our fisher numbers are down. I know I instituted a bag limit of 1 to 3 in the early 80s when fisher numbers dropped off. So they have been managed to maintain their number. But the last few years, there's been some disease that has been killing them off. Patrick Tate, New Hampshire Fish and Game wildlife biologist who took over the fur bearer position when I retired in 2007, has been collecting fisher carcasses from the few trapped by trappers and sending them to UNH for at the diagnostic lab. But I don't think they are certain as to why fisher numbers have declined so significantly the last few years. So fisher numbers are down. I think there is a very limited take now by trappers. There's a limited season, limited limit, but fisher numbers currently, as of the 2020s, beginning really in 2010, the fisher numbers have declined and remain lower than they were certainly by the mid to 1970s into the early 80s. So fishers are still common statewide, but not as numerous as they were 25 years ago. This is wildlife biologist Eric Orr for What's Wild in New Hampshire.